So, our question is, why did the Danes settle in England? Let's find out. Here's a scene that hopefully looks quite familiar. Um, when the Vikings first appeared in England, the Saxons, who obviously lived in England at the time, saw them as something different, something unhuman almost. Many saw them as a punishment sent by God. How can you explain the sudden rash of violence that we've seen in England? It must be God's punishment for the people of England. Maybe they're not good enough Christians. Maybe they need to pray harder. That's also how they were seen. I guess we're talking at a time point after Lindisfarne's been sacked, which happens in 792. A couple of years later, the monastery on the Scottish island of Iona is also targeted. And we just see these frequent raids from the late 700s and into the 800s, and yeah, they're causing all kinds of problems. So the Christian Saxons see these Vikings, these attackers, as this punishment sent by God. There's several reasons for that. One reason is that they came from these unknown lands. They just appeared in England from over the seas. So they came from, they were the other. They came from elsewhere, not of England. So that's one reason. Another reason is that they were considered heathens. Heathen in this kind of context means that they weren't Christians. So these Vikings who arrived, they had their own gods, and none of them were Jesus. And so, yeah, they were not seen as Christian, and therefore, again, is that they are punishment sent by God. They also targeted Christian settlements. So again, maybe the expectation is that if there is problems in this country, religious problems that God needs to punish, it makes sense that he might target those kind of establishments where they're not helping people being good Christians. And so, yeah, perhaps that's one of the reasons why the Saxons saw them as this kind of punishment from God. Another reason was that these Vikings seemed to be desperately keen to kill those who got in their way. They were utterly brutal. The attacks at Lindisfarne, as I mentioned before, was terrible. Lots of monks died. Likewise at Iona, many died there. So, yeah, they're willing to kill. And they didn't seem to be afraid of death either. Much like these demons, they don't care about what happens to them. They have no real concern about their safety. They'll go in and into battle without too much concern. So this is how the Vikings were perceived in the late 700s. However, not all changes, I suppose, but there is certainly a shift in how the Saxons and the Danes, the Vikings, kind of have to see each other. So whereas before these outsiders, the Danes start to settle in England, and that's around the year 850. And from that point, the kind of perception of what these Danes are like shifts from this punishment sent by God to being neighbours and being these people that we have to live side by side with. And so that, as we'll see particularly in our next session, that changes people's perceptions of them, and we'll look at why that is the case. So the next question I want to look at is, why did the Danes begin to settle in England? What was their reasons for doing so? One thing is probably worth considering that is often overlooked is that the Danes are farmers. Like the Saxons, the people in medieval times and before predominantly were farmers. That's how like 95% of the population of certainly England kind of operated. They were small scale farmers. But this problem for the Danes was that there's limitations on farming in Scandinavia. And when I talk about the Danes, I'm talking about the Norwegians as well as the people from Denmark. So some push factors, to use a geography term, what's pushing the Danes from Scandinavia to England? Well, it's four actually. Firstly, Scandinavia is quite hilly, particularly Norway. Norway is a very hilly country, which isn't particularly good if you are reliant on crops. The crops do not grow so well there. And so we can understand why some Danes would want to leave Norway. And again, I'm using the word Danes again. They want to leave Norway to come and find more fertile lands where crop growing is a little bit easier. Another factor, and again, this is more relevant to Denmark, is Denmark's got some quite sandy landscapes. It's flatter, and so sands can kind of blow in. That limits the amount of grass growth, and with the limitations on grass growth, you get limitations on how many animals you can have as a farmer. And so, again, that's one of the factors that might lead to some Danish people going, actually, maybe we should go elsewhere, and obviously to England. Another issue, again, particularly in Norway, is we see this kind of spike in population growth. There seems to be a bit of a squeeze on resources, and so some Norwegians are encouraged, or the Danes are encouraged, to come across to England to try and find more lands. And in particular, we have this situation in Norway, which we'll identify when we get to our to our Normans topic, because the Normans introduced this to England as well. But they have a system called primogeniture, which essentially means that the eldest son in the family inherits all the land. So if you are a Viking, you've got an older brother, then you are not going to inherit the lands of your father. Your older brother will. And so for the Vikings, or for the Danes, and I'm using those words interchangeably, going out and finding new land is going to be a very important priority for them. So again, England looks attractive because there's not that many people living in England at the time. There's lots of land available, and so they like the idea of coming to England and claiming some land for themselves. So those are the push factors, and we can kind of summarize those push factors as economic reasons. We're talking about the Danes coming to England to be able to make a life for themselves, to earn their, make their keep. And so these are economic reasons why people were coming to England to be able to support themselves and their families. Okay, so that's the question of why did the Danes settle in England. Our next question is, topic is, how did they expand their control of England? What occurred? And as you can see at the bottom of the screen, we've got a little timeline. We're going to kind of hit the key points in this timeline to try and identify why we see this expansion. So let's start in the year 860, and there are raids going on as per usual. Vikings are coming over every so often and raiding the English coasts. What we have, though, in the year 860, is the Northumbrian king, a chap called King Ella, and again, the spelling of Ella is spelt all kinds of ways. So if you see it spelt with an A at the end, they didn't really write names down back in those days, so it's got all kinds of spellings. But the Northumbrian king, Ella, kills the Viking leader, a chap called Ragnar Lodbrok. Again, different spellings for Lodbrok. Either way, he kills the Viking leader by throwing him, as you can see in this picture, into a pit of poisonous snakes. And so he dies, according to legend. Whether that's true or not, and whether this whole episode happened, we're unsure. Either way, that happens in 860. Perhaps what King Aila doesn't realise is that Ragnar Lodbrok had 5 sons who weren't too best pleased when they find out that their father has been killed, apparently by these poisonous snakes. And so they decide they're going to get their revenge. And so in the year 865, they put together a huge army. Before we've had raids, Viking armies arriving in England and raiding, and then they disappear again. This army, they call it the Great Heathen Army, this huge army that comes along isn't about raiding, it's about conquering, it's about taking land. So it's much bigger than the armies that we had before. You might be thinking, well, how big is this army? Unfortunately, we don't know. The main source of our information from this time period is the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is written intermittently by particularly monks, which kind of record what's going on. All they say is that it's much larger than the armies that came before it. So this great heathen army, which is how the Saxons describe it, again, heathen, if you remember, means non-Christian, so it's kind of, they're using this word to kind of criticise the Danes. This great heathen army arrives in England, and they target, first of all, East Anglia, which is that blue patch on the map there. Now, the East Anglians, when this huge army arrives, are a little bit nervous, obviously, and so they make a deal with the Norwegians and the Danes, and they say, look, we give you hospitality, we allow you to stay in Thetford, which is in Suffolk, and we'll give you horses and supplies, please don't hurt us. And the Vikings accept this. They're not here to get revenge on the East Anglians, so they get these supplies, and then they make their way north. And so in the year 866, they head north. Now, they target the town of York, where some Danes have already settled in the past, and they capture it. Now, the Danes call York Jorvik, so you might see some written sources at some point which refers to the town of Jorvik. That's just how the Danes call York. York is really important to the Danes. It essentially becomes their capital in England. That's the kind of the Danish centre. You might remember, or you're about to learn actually, when we did the Normans topic, that when we have 1066 and we have these 3 or 4 claimants to the throne, one of them is Harold Hardrada, and when he arrives, he has the Battle of Stamford Bridge. But before that, he's already captured York because it's so important to the Vikings, and so he knows that too. Anyway, back to 866. The Danes have come along and they've captured York as and that's going to be their base. So this map will hopefully help us understand the following events that occur in 867 and gives an idea, some context of what's going on. So this great heathen army go after King Aella of Northumbria and they kill him, and they conquer much of Northumbria in the process. Then, with Northumbria, and again York's in Northumbria, with Northumbria secured, they can then turn their focus to Mercia, and so they go about attacking Mercia. Now, if you remember the tactic used by the East Anglians when the Danes arrived, it was to pay them off. So after a few battles, the Mercians decide, yeah, we can't keep doing this, we need to pay them off. And so they pay the Vikings in gold and supplies in exchange for peace. Now we call this this offering of goods and supplies Danegeld, which essentially is Danish gold. And so the Mercians are employing a tactic here to just basically buy off the Vikings, give them money, make them go away, which, as we see or will see, is a short-term tactic that isn't always particularly successful. But they've done it, and the Vikings leave Mercia. But where do they go next? Well, they're baying for blood, and so they go back to East Anglia, and they invade it. And in their process of invading East Anglia, they killed the local king, King Edmund of East Anglia. The story of him dying eventually leads him to becoming a saint. Now, he probably died on the battlefield. The historians seem to think so. But a myth has kind of developed where he apparently refused to go out into battle. He said, no, Jesus would rather I put down my weapons and take this on the chin. And the Vikings decide, well, if you're going to be like that, if you're not going to renounce Jesus, if you're going to insist on being a Christian, then we'll test your faith. So they tie him to a tree and they fire arrows into him, and he refuses to kind of renounce Christ. He refuses to stop being a Christian, and that annoys the Vikings so much that they chop off his head. Now, again, this story is almost certainly a myth. When King Edmund's followers are looking for his head, they cry out, friend, where is your head? And apparently the head shouts, here, here, here. And they find it in a bush being protected by a wolf who is protecting it so no other creatures can attack this head. Anyway, so they reclaim his head. So that's how the myth goes. So that happens in 869. The Vikings have captured East Anglia. So what we see from between 869 and 874 is they go back on the attack. They capture parts of Mercia as well. And so we have in this map a really good kind of summary of the situation in England and Scotland, as you can see, in Wales and Ireland there, of where the Danes control. The Danes are controlling that kind of reddish colour area, which we call Danelaw, because they follow the law of the Danes. They don't follow the English laws and the Saxon laws and customs. They predominantly follow the Danish laws and customs. And in the yellow bit, as we'll find out in our next session, that's the territory of Wessex, the one kingdom that is yet to fall to the Vikings. And they are led by a chap called Arthur. How great is he? Well, we'll find out in our next one. The last thing I'm going to talk about, though, is that once the Danes control this territory, which they do in 874, we start to see more migration again. Danes, with this territory secured, continue to come in from Denmark and from Norway to settle and to become farmers. And so with this greater flow of migration. So England is becoming a real mix of both Angles and Saxons, the Anglo-Saxons and the Danes. And in many parts of England, they're living side by side, because even in Danelaw, there's still Saxons living there. Okay.